For y'all, thanks so much for joining us today for Tech That Works, Unlocking Better Models for Digital Government. We are going to do some quick introductions here, and then we will get into an interactive demonstration, hear some success stories from government, and then move to an open question and answer session. Before we get into it, my name is Amanda Pyrino. I am the manager of government affairs for the state capacity team at the Niskanen Center. The Niskanen Center is a think tank that promotes policies that advance prosperity, opportunity, and human flourishing, guided by the belief that a free market and an effective government are mutually dependent. And in particular, on our state capacity team, focuses on the ability of government to implement the policies that it passed for. We think about that across four kind of pillars. One of them is about hiring the right people and firing the wrong ones. Second is about reducing procedural bloat. Third, we look at investing in digital infrastructure and really enabling technology in government. And the fourth is about closing feedback loops around outcomes. So thinking about legislation, executive branch, and the residents who experience government services. We are really thrilled to be co-hosting a series of events on the implementation gap with the POPVOX Foundation, and I'm going to turn it over to Aubrey Wilson, who will talk about POPVOX. Thank you. Good afternoon, and to everyone. We're so thankful that you're spending some of your Monday with us. As I said, my name is Aubrey Wilson. I'm Director of Government Innovation at POPVOX Foundation. For those of you that are unfamiliar with our work, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that focuses on helping democratic institutions keep pace with a rapidly changing world. To that end, we are also a bunch of recovering Hill staffers, as we like to say, which really kind of drives our passion as to why we're so excited about this event and the series overall within its Niskanen. Our goal is to find ways, whether that be new workflows, tools, or experiences that really help boost legislative staffers' capacity on the Hill, both to support your boss in ensuring that they're best set up for success, and also that your policy implementation actually really matches the intent of what you wanted to achieve to begin with. To that end, as I said, I'm so incredibly passionate about today's topic in particular. As a former legislative assistant, I remember working on legislation and truly struggling with what to put in the text that my boss's intent was really actually carried out by the agencies. This is particularly true once I figured out that so much legislative intent is implemented through technology. And so crafting that legislation with no technology background myself was always a challenge of how to balance really fine details with also letting tech teams that aren't in government do what they do best. Today's discussion about authorizing and appropriating following a product model versus a project model is one of those approaches that I feel like truly fuel POPVOX Foundation's mission. It's an approach that showcases the importance of the legislative and executive branches actually working together, and how that can lead to immense taxpayer savings and improved government efficiency and effectiveness for constituents. Lastly, this approach is one that can boost congressional oversight powers by keeping members more in the loop throughout the development process of new technology versus having the signing of legislation into law being the last time that you actually follow up with policy as built network. We are excited to be partnering with Niskanen and all of our incredible panelists for today's event. And with that, I will pass it back to Amanda. Thank you so much, Aubrey. And we will introduce all of our incredible panelists as we get there. But before we jump into it, wanted to just do a quick introduction of what do we mean by the product model, and in particular, clarify the differences between the product model and what we often see in government, which is the project model. And this concept is based on a lot of the work and writing of our senior fellow, Jen Polka. And I want to point out, she writes that this is nominally about technology in government, but it applies far beyond technology. There are a lot of places in government where we need to acquire ongoing capabilities and not just static things. And whenever we're doing that, following this kind of product model instead of a project model can be really helpful. So let's get into it. Government typically follows a project model. And that would start with a procurement or a large appropriation from Congress for a particular project. Requirements will be developed by usually an internal team in the agency. They'll gather all of the different requirements of what does this piece of software need to be able to do. Then a request for proposal will be written, or an RFP. Bids from contractors will be sourced and evaluated, and a winner will be chosen. The long list of requirements that they need to build the software. The contractor will staff up a big team
to build that piece of software, check off all of the boxes, all of those requirements. And then most of them will leave. There will be a short period of user acceptance testing just to make sure, hey, all of the requirements have been met. The software is ready to go. The contractors will leave and the project will move into what's called operations and maintenance. You might have heard of O&M funding, which is a separate kind of budget line, which is important. This is what we usually work. When we contrast that with the product model, instead of having one episodic kind of appropriation, the product model will fund a smaller team within government to work on that product. And they will start by doing a discovery sprint, usually where they test out what are the problems that users are facing and do you actually even need to build software? This way, they are iterating and learning as they go. If there are complex concepts like a big data integration or something like that, they can test it out beforehand to make sure it will work before the whole piece of software has been built. They can develop prototypes. They can bring in contractors for small pieces of building as needed, but there is an internal team that holds the product vision and provides clear direction to vendors throughout the whole process. So there's a couple of important differences to call out here. One of them is that in the project model, the first test with users generally does not happen until the whole piece of software has been built at the end. And that test is usually, again, just making sure all of the requirements have been met. Whereas in a product model, we're testing with users the whole way through, even deciding if the piece of software needs to be built based on users. More importantly, we want to call out that something like software that is not static, once you leave and leave it in operations and maintenance, that's just maintaining and keeping it going as is. But we all know policy changes over time. New technologies are developed and things change in the agency. So if you have this kind of project model, you get to a point where the piece of software isn't working anymore. So then you need another appropriation from Congress to modernize the software. And then they will, again, collect all of these requirements, figure out what's needed. It's probably way more complex this time around because everyone has been building their little workarounds to keep up to date with the policies that have changed, the technology that has been changing. And this modernization usually costs more and requires more people to work on it. Then again, you go through the process, check up all of the requirements. Even if it works, you're going to face this over and over again. And another piece of the puzzle is that you're just checking off the requirements. You're building what we might call concrete bugs. Yes, it meets all of the requirements, but does the piece of software actually work? There are a couple of failures that may immediately come to mind, like healthcare.gov or recently the new Better Facts Sub. Those weren't tested until the end, and then there was a big problem, and the rollout was complicated. So thinking instead about this product model, where you have this lower level of funding over time, consistently, for a team to be iterating, making changes as there are updates. Once you zoom out and kind of look at this vision, you see that actually on the long term, this can work a lot better. So lots of differences between the project model and product model, but the key things to kind of point out here are the episodic large investments in the project model versus the ongoing kind of moderate investment in the product model. In the project model, you're usually bringing in a lot of contractors. Product model, you may do that too, but you have a team that is focused internally. And in the project model, we see higher rates of failure and frustration, whereas product model usually ends up with some actual working software. So there are one-pagers right up front here with these graphs. If you want to take them, bring them back to your office, share them with friends. We also have a commentary up here written by Ann Lewis called How to Save $1 Billion, which really gets into some more of those problems with the current project model and ways that lots of projects in government have accidentally wasted $1 billion. So check that out. But I'm going to turn it over now to Ann, who is the former director of the Technology Transformation Service at GSA, the General Services Administration, and she's going to walk us through a demonstration about why the cost of technology can vary.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here.
So we're going to play a game, and the game is guess how much this website costs to build. And not surprisingly, there'll be some paradoxes here. So what I'm going to try and compare here are not just government projects to each other that sometimes use the product model, which we believe works more effectively and controls for cost and risk and is more likely to build what people actually need. Contrast that with the project model, but we're also going to contrast it with the private sector. Private sector doesn't get it right all of the time, but by default does use a product model for both funding and iterative development. And so that has some surprising side effects. Next slide, please. All right, next one. So how much do you think it costs to build all of Spotify? Not ongoing over time, just to go from 0 to 1, the initial launch. If you're feeling confident, throw out some numbers. It's up to $1,000. So $7,000. Okay, $7,000. Really took it later. All right. Millions. Yep, millions. Yeah. Price is Right rules. Okay, so we've got $7,000 and several million. All right. 25 million. Okay. Next slide, please. How much do you think it costs to build the Better FAFSA project? You might remember the legislation that was intended to simplify and make the program more accessible for lower income students. How much do you think it costs? Hundreds of millions? 100 million? A billion? Okay. Right there. 65 million. All the team fighting publish priority publish vibration so that cybersecurity budget is occurred about Odegon. There's a lot of complexity in there. That's definitely true. Okay, so these are good guesses. Next slide, please. How much do you think it costs to build Iris Direct File? $1 million, 4.5 million. Okay, you're going to hear the full detailed answer soon. Okay, next. State Medicaid. So there are 25 different contracts here for different states. Some of the same vendors working for them. So it might cost more because there are more states. It might cost less because there's a fewer number of vendors for using solutions. So there's a lot of variation. How much do you think state Medicaid eligibility software cost? That one. 99. But any other guesses?
I think it would be very hard to create iterative code and the one which is full types that will reach the market.
A lot of coordination.
No.
Yeah. There are a lot of implementation compared here. Next slide. USA.gov. I don't know, you may have seen this website. It's a portal for benefits information. How much do you think this cost to build? 17 million. Okay, any other guesses? 25 million. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thanks for playing the game. Okay, now the big reveal of how much they actually. So to go from 0 to 1 and launch the initial version of Spotify, which is all of the software and networking, but not the content agreements for selling the music, it was about $17 million, according to my former deputy who used to work there. This simplified or better FAFSA project, simplified legislation intending to streamline the student experience, changed so much of the front-end and back-end software components of the existing FAFSA system. The software never exists in a vacuum. There's a previous version of all of the rules and regulations that we decided on getting encoded into software that people had previously used before the changes were rolled out. And so the legislative changes ended up forcing software changes to the extent that it ended up costing hundreds of millions of dollars. It didn't completely get all the way done. And so this is a place where there's a really interesting paradox around when are we incurring implementation costs and are we intending to? And then some of this also depends on the choices that vendors make. Sometimes vendors have built things in a more simple and flexible way. And sometimes they have built concrete boats in the past that now you have to modernize, and that's expensive. So there's a lot of variation. Iris Direct File costs around $25 million. State Medicaid, billions of dollars. And you're going to hear a lot more about this from Luke. Luke saved a lot of money here, but interesting to sort of like pull on some of the threads that a person in the audience had mentioned a couple of slides ago, there are a lot of states. Does that mean if you have 25 states, you need to build 25 different versions of software? If that's an implementation choice, do we all in different states use different versions of Google or Facebook or, the products, Spotify, for example? The software as a service model can be used to create economies of scale across agency boundaries or state boundaries if you're allowed to do that, if you don't create legislation that prevents that, and also if vendors are incentivized to make those choices that are more efficient. And that there's a whole world of variation there. Interestingly, just $6 billion alone on eligibility and enrollment systems. And you might think, well, the legislation for eligibility is complicated, so maybe the software should be also. But then think about all the different kinds of forms that you have filled out to get access to consumer products or to manage data in your own life. Just because there are 100 different questions in a form doesn't mean the form needs to cost, like $1 billion. It certainly should not cost $100 million, but it could cost thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The same website, the same code, the same data model, the same way that systems integrate together. In my personal experience, having worked across the public, private, nonprofit sectors, the same software can cost $100,000 or $10 million, or in the case of government, $10 billion. And sometimes spending more money does not give you better results. Sometimes it actually incentivizes vendors to continue to overcharge you forever because they built business models on it. So it's a very complicated set of trends here. Like former deputy and I used to measure our tech budget line items in units of Spotify. So we would take a look at sites like Integrated Award Environment and say, should this be 10 Spotifys? Did I start 1.2 Spotifys? Maybe that's good. So there's a lot of variation there that like we can control for. We don't have to accept the prices that we get by default. We can control them, but in a complex set of ways that have to do with how legislation and policy intersect with procurement and implementation management. There aren't easy answers here, but I want to just demonstrate that there's a range of possible prices we can pay for the same thing that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the value of benefits that are delivered to the American public. Awesome. Thanks, Anne. So now we're going to get into some success stories from government. Just all these big dollar figures, but want to talk about using the product model in government for some of those better outcomes. And we are joined today by two incredible panelists, Marie Stephenson and Luke Farrell, who both formerly worked for the U.S. Digital Service. Marie and Luke, do you two want to do just a quick intro so the audience knows who you are before we jump in?
Hi, everyone. I'm Luke Farrell. I am finally allowed to talk to you all here now that I no longer work in the government, which is a great delight. I was at the U.S. Digital Service, where I was our product lead across much of our safety net benefits, and in particular on SNAP and importantly Medicaid, everyone's favorite topic today in particular, and worked for several years with CMS to improve how we deliver Medicaid benefits to individuals through the technology down at the state level. So we'll talk more about that work, but we saved state governments $120 million. I got in a van, drove around America, and got 10 million people health care. That van only had a few software engineers and a few designers, and we were still able to get it done. And so happy to talk more about that.
My name is Marie Stephenson. I used to work at the U.S. Digital Service. My entire career, 4 years at USDS, suspect tax, which was super fun. And I love to work at that scale because the tax from child tax credit expansion all the way through to giving people the opportunity to file their taxes for free is incredible. Prior to that, my last role in government, I was one of the first employees of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and set up the agency and the tech team that launched our first website. It was not vector. That was a pretty answer. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we are going to get to a part of the agenda where we'll have open questions and answers. So please, as folks are talking about their experiences, any questions that you have, we will get there. But Luke, I want to turn to you first. You led a team at USDS that kept millions of Americans enrolled in their health coverage through the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency. And you have a unique point of view working on both Medicaid and SNAP with federal and state government. Can you tell us about how you use the kind of product model approach in your work?
Sure. So maybe to set some context, at the end of the public health emergency, with the end of the pandemic, we had to re-enroll a little under 90 million Americans in their Medicaid coverage for the first time in 3 years. And so that's like an enormous administrative challenge. And it was presenting kind of a crisis of customer experience for people across the country. So those 80, 90 million people had their health insurance continuously eligible through the pandemic. And then at the end, they suddenly needed to fill out 90 million packets worth of information about their health insurance eligibility. And so we were staring down the barrel of losing tens of millions of people from their Medicaid coverage, not because of some act of Congress, but because of administrative burden, right? Like today we're fighting over 9 million people losing their coverage because of the recent Republican House bill. But we were almost on the verge of losing that many people just because of paperwork in the government. And so what we did was we knew that states needed help and they needed tech capacity because a lot of this was adjudicated by these old, big build systems operated by a very small number of vendors. And those systems were falling down and breaking, and again, jeopardizing the coverage of millions of Americans. And so we realized that the only way to go fix it was to show up in those states and actually roll up our sleeves and try to help fix those software systems. And we did that, and we got nearly 10 million people their coverage renewed. We prevented over 2 million people from losing their coverage. So that's 2 million people who can go to the doctor, who can get their prescriptions. Those are children whose long-term life outcomes are better because they're covered by Medicaid. And there are like thousands of people who are alive today because of that work. So this like government technology stuff that we do, it's boring and esoteric. It's about budgets, about Deloitte being a horrible contractor sometimes, which I can say now. But it's also about making sure people actually get the coverage and the benefits that they deserve. And so we did that through, I would say, kind of three, to your question around like product principles. One was actually providing in-house capacity as a provider of technology. So we had engineers on our staff, we had user researchers on our staff through the U.S. Digital Service who could show up in a state and would roll up their sleeves and actually try to fix things. And then second, I would say we did user research. So we actually talked to real people who were trying to renew their coverage, and we worked to understand, why is it so difficult for you to fill out this form? What if we automated away certain parts of this? And so we automated away huge parts, both on caseworkers and on individuals, which ended up saving state governments over $100 million in just like processing work. And then third, which was important, was that we like actually worked to deploy fast and to iterate with the states. So every state is different and every state needs something different. And we were a flexible enough, not prescribed directly by Congress operating team that was able to show up, understand what South Carolina needed, understand what California needed, and work to actually implement and improve the systems that we were presented with. And it worked, and we should do more of it. So happy to talk more in Q&A about how to do that.
Well, thanks. Gracie, I'm going to turn to you now to talk a little bit about direct file, which has been celebrated for incredible outcomes, like more than 140,000 returns filed for free in 2024, and 90% of users rating their experience as excellent or above average. Despite the news that the administration is shutting down direct file, what are the best practices that your team used that led to direct file's incredible outcomes, and what could be embraced or replicated by others?
Fantastic. Consumer Finance.gov version 1 cost $106,000. So, and then what the result of 1942 and that version of it.
Look at the
So it's 2010 or 2011. So direct file, the free text filing product that we launched, there's a whole lot to unpack about its process and how it will speed, but at the core, it was an iterative approach built and supported by an in-house product team. We were effectively a startup team with government. When the Inflation Reduction Act passed, there was a paragraph in there that asked the IRS to do a study on whether or not taxpayers want to use this kind of thing. And part of it was to ask their opinion. And everyone took that to mean a survey. And imagine getting a survey from somebody saying, press 1 if you want the IRS to file your taxes through an easy way on a government website. Press 2 if you don't. Like, that is probably what the legislation expected. Maybe, didn't read that, sorry. And what we decided to do was to actually use that money to build a prototype of the product and stuff to put in front of users saying, hey, would you want the IRS to build this awesome, beautiful product? And people resoundingly said yes, across a number of reasons. Number one, once they saw that it was great and it had a great user experience and it was very straightforward, they were like, heck yeah. Number two, time and time again, this is before address, people here think that a .gov website is going to be the most trustworthy website. They want to use a .gov. They'll say they need it, but it's usually a way and poorly designed. And so what we try to do is to reset our expectations. Say, look, here's a great tax product. So that was done with an in-house team, primarily in-house team. And we consistently and iteratively every day, practically we're putting that product in front of the users. It went live in January 2024. I'm just going to keep talking about some of the principles that are important about the product approach. Our rollout, there was not a deadline in legislation that started must go live in the state, which meant that we could choose to do it when we thought the product was ready. And thank goodness we did that, because when we first launched Direct File, there was one user who volunteered, saying, yes, I'll be your first user. And yes, you can watch me over Teams, my service, and I can share. And thank goodness we did that, because had it been a convection or White House mandate or whatever, a fake deadline, it wouldn't have worked. And had that would have been a big bang website launch that wouldn't have worked. And we reset the connection, transmitted to her tax return, but it was a great example of how to gain. How you launch things in the private sector is you start small, you will make sure the product is working, you continue to gain trust with your users, and then you roll it out to larger and larger populations. I also think that when I take a big step back, this team of people that built Direct File, they got the chance, and I'm using the past tense, which is a total bummer, but they got the chance to work on a product that people love, and to make it better every week of the year, and to launch a better product year-round for people. That's what we should want, right? That's what we should want for our government services, for our people to use these products, and for our teams to deliver. And that's what this team got to do. All throughout balance season, they pushed more and more pre-population. That is the ability of, when you log in to file your taxes, the IRS says, hey, we've got this form for you. Do you want to repopulate it into your tax return? And you could say yes. And so that's a great example of probably what a normal person who's not in this room would expect. But for us, we kind of get caught up. We're like, oh, it's a lot of work, and no, it's very scary, and the websites don't work. And industry. And it actually works because that's what people wanted, and we were able to do it. So we had an incredibly talented team. So there was a ton of opportunity. I think Direct File is the example of the product model, and it's such a bar that that it's there's a signal there that they want to fill it. And it was funny when Amanda was talking through this. There was a vendor that was asked to bid on doing this product, and this was their time. And they put user research. So let's say the product will launch in January. They put user research in October. And just to be clear, we had already reset our entire strategy for Direct File between January and October about 6 times. And they would never put it in front of users after it was already built in October. We had an opportunity to restart and say, okay, this doesn't work. We're going to try this. We're going to try that. We're going to try this. And that was a great example of what we were able to do. Direct File had a 96% user satisfaction rate this year. Its Net Promoter Score, which is was 82 plus 82. Apple's, by comparison, Apple is 72. Again, these are things that we should expect from our government.
Thank you all so much for sharing that. We're going to move into Q&A, so start getting those questions ready, but quickly want to just turn and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the Technology Modernization Fund, TMF. Everyone here may know Representative Mason, Representative Connolly just introduced TMF reauthorization in the House. But I'd love if you could share a little bit about the TMF and how it can help agencies move to this kind of product model approach.
Sure. So historically, the majority of the funding that goes into building what we think of as products, what you might call IT or infrastructure, has been organized in these big bang, large amounts of money up front and then minimal O&M in that sort of structure budget. What you end up with is a lot of really kind of like bloated, overly complex software that needed to fit into, like, for example, if you were to tell an agency you have $200 million to build this thing, it will cost $200 million because if it doesn't, agencies get in trouble. So even if the real cost of that system was maybe $20 million, the agency and vendors will find some way to make it cost $200 million because they don't want to lose the budget. So you get these, what Jen Halper has called concrete boats, which are, layers and layers and layers and layers of requirements on top of, here's the goal, here's the outcome, here's what users actually need, that then also helps fill up the budget, creates a lot of complexity that then becomes a significant barrier to improvement or modernization over time. So you get these really big, complex systems, vendors that are incentivized to continue making them cost a lot of money, and then not enough O&M for the product or the technology to evolve over time as user needs evolve, as the technology ecosystem evolves, et cetera. And so then when eventually these systems get to be so broken that everyone is complaining and calling their Congress people, and it becomes a priority to modernize, sometimes the size of the modernization activity doesn't fit neatly into 1 or 2 or 4 year funding streams or 4 year administration or political, I guess, power structures. Like sometimes the modernization will take 5 or 7 years, and that's just how long it takes, and it costs a lot of money. So having the TMF available as a flexible funding source that can fit the needs of the modernization activity is super helpful for helping agencies get out of those kinds of problems when they can tend to get stuck in it for a while. And the modernization activities are hard everywhere. I would say in the private sector, modernization or a legacy system migration, getting off of a really complicated old foundation for a system that it's about as complicated as if you have a house that's built on a foundation and then like the foundation cracked and you want to improve the house somehow. Like the way that we think about tech modernization is about as hard as taking apart that house and completely rebuilding it somewhere else. So sometimes you don't have the time or the money to do that effectively or have a political cover to do that effectively. So having this additional source of funding that can be flexible to those needs allows the implementation leads the flexibility they need to plan and actually get the modernization done. When you don't have something like that, what you end up getting are a lot of stop and start attempts at modernization, which are actually more expensive and add more system bloat than just not even attempting the modernization at all. So you really, once you start a modernization activity, you really want to be able to get it done regardless of administration and budgeting changes. So anyway, that's, I think, some strategic reasons why the TMF is so important.
Absolutely. So what can you all do here on the from where you sit? As we've been talking about this, what would real change really look like? And that would be Congress focusing on enabling agencies to do that, which we know is a totally different way of working. When we talk about removing constraints and mandates, it's not passing a bill and asking an agency to do something and it's defining the process they need to do it, but actually removing the constraints and then enabling them to get to the definition of success. Also defaulting digital government and technology appropriations to this kind of continuous low level of funding for products rather than large appropriation, which we know is not the way that Congress works right now. So in the interim, in the world we are living in, what can you do? And we have this in 2 buckets, one around legislation and kind of engaging with rulemaking, and a couple of things here. One, legislating about outcomes. Just getting really clear on what the definition of success is, but not writing in the exact process that an agency needs to follow to get there, allowing the learning that Luke and Marisa and Anne are talking about. We talked about, you don't need to legislate the font size on the website, but being very clear about what are the outcomes that you want agents to get to. Not funding or mandating just modernization, but being clear about the outcomes like resilience or scalability and adaptability, so that it's not modernization is done, check the box, but a continuous process. When possible, moving towards that low-level funding over time, finding ways to fund product teams instead of projects, and encouraging the kind of modular contracting. And then on the other side, not necessarily legislating, but when you're looking at oversight or building kind of feedback loops, asking for called demos, not memos, and that's asked to actually see the software or the product. So often Congress asks for a report. What is going on? But what about actually looking and seeing the software so you can see the problems, and you're not asking folks to spend a bunch of time writing a report that may or may not get read in the pile of all of the other reports that are getting sent to you all over their project. And then one of the big ones is celebrating when things are going well publicly. Often oversight has kind of a negative connotation of, oh, agencies are getting dragged out for a hearing in Congress and who's getting in trouble, but really celebrating when things are working well, either publicly or privately. Even sending a letter could really help teams within agencies that are working on things. And we've heard this. So really just starting to shift to that kind of more positive and trust-based relationship. So lots here, but we'd love to open it up for questions, either about these kind of pieces of what you all can do here, stories from Mauricio and Luke. What questions do you all have?